Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our Australian Institute of International Affairs function for tonight. Welcome to those who are here, a great crowd here at Holding Redlick in Brisbane, and to those who are joining us online as well. I'm absolutely thrilled to have our guest contributor tonight, Major General Mick Ryan, AM, also an adjunct professor at the University of Queensland. Mick is going to talk to us tonight about the Russian-Ukraine conflict, his views of where it's been, where it will go, and what the implications are for Australia and the rest of the world. Just a little bit about Mick. He graduated from the Royal Military College Duntroon in 1989 as a combat engineer. He has served, I should say, he was awarded the Order of Australia for his command of the task force in the Reconstruction Task Force in southern Afghanistan and his other military service. He worked in the Pakistan-Afghanistan Coordination Cell on the US Joint Staff as a Division Chief for Governance, Development and Engagement, and subsequently in the New Strategy and Policy Division. He also led the Joint Staff effort for the President's Afghanistan-Pakistan Annual Review for the National Security Committee in 2010, and led PAC support to General John Allen in his Senate confirmation for command in Afghanistan. A Senate confirmation, that must have been character building for him. During his appointment, he was responsible for Army's contribution to the Defence White Paper, and of course we've got another one coming up, and Force Structure Review, Army's development of future structures, experimentation and fostering professional discourse through the Army Journal and establishment of the online Land Power Forum. And I should say this, that Mick is a well-published person as well as a very articulate and substantial contributor to public discourse in the oral sense. He has a Bachelor of Degrees in Asian Studies from the University of New England and a graduate of the Australian Defence Force School of Languages. He tells me that he's a fluent Bahasa Indonesia speaker of that wonderful country. He is a distinguished graduate of the United States Marine Corps Command and Staff College and a graduate of the US Marine Corps School of Advanced Warfighting. He has deep experience in the fields of strategy, interagency and joint operations command and leadership, as well as professional military education. I, for one, absolutely enjoy reading what he writes, his public contributions. Let's see, we've got Ian Kemish in the front. Ian on diplomacy is, like the matching bookend of Mick in relation to military and strategic matters. Both wonderful contributors. So I should, before I hand over to Mick to lead us off with some thoughts, acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are here tonight, the Yagara and the Turrbal people, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Well, Mick, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here this evening. I appreciate the long and embarrassing introduction. What I want to do now is give some very brief opening comments, because I think the Q&A and the discussion is more important. I think most of us, regardless of what we do during the day at this time of the night, aren't up for PowerPoints and long talks at you. I think a conversation, Q&A is a better way for us to have an effective discourse. So just a very quick, I guess, introduction to the war for those who may not follow it as closely. The war did not start in 2022, it started in 2014, and long before that, Ukraine had been preparing for Russian aggression against it since it achieved independence in 1991. Of course, under the Budapest Accords, it gave up its nuclear weapons. It was the second largest nuclear state in the world at that time. It willingly gave up its nuclear weapons because it received security guarantees from the United States, United Kingdom, and Russia at that time. At least two of them have followed through on those security guarantees. 2014, clearly two parts of that war. One was easier than the other. Crimea went off pretty much without a hitch, almost a textbook study in information operations, subversion, and taking over a province of another sovereign country. The Donbass, not so easy, it was quite bloody. It resulted in multiple Minsk Accords and has been an ongoing conflict ever since 2014. If you go to downtown Kiev, you can walk along the big blue wall that has the photos and the names of every Ukrainian soldier who's been killed out there since the first day of that war in 2014. It stops in 2021. Unfortunately, I think that war will have to be far, far, far longer for what's happened in the last 14 months or so. So February last year, we saw the Russian invasion on multiple axes from the north, the northeast, the east and the south, some having success, like in the south and in the east, others not so much in the northeast, as well as the aerial campaign, which was pretty short and not very decisive, mainly because the Russians didn't want to break what they were going to own in 10 days. Well, at least that was their plan. They planned for a 10-day campaign after which they would get rid of the government and replace it with someone more amenable to not Russia's requirements, but Putin's requirements. At least at that time, you could kind of differentiate a little bit between the two. Now I don't think it's the same. So over the course of the war, we've seen it go through various phases. Obviously, phase one saw the initial invasion and the defeat of the Russians north of Kiev. Phase two, the Russians changed their strategy to concentrate in one single axis, which was the Donbass. And we saw this in the campaign around Severodonetsk, this change and that area. And that went through pretty much until the Americans gave the Ukrainians HIMARS, and then they kind of went berserk and stopped the Russians almost dead. Third phase was the Ukrainian offensives, which proved to everyone they could do offensive operations, which a lot of people, including a lot of Americans, saying, well, they can defend, but they'll never be able to do offensive stuff. Proved everyone wrong, again, as they have throughout this war. Kherson and Kharkiv were both very different, but both very effective offensive campaigns. We're now into, I think, the last gasp of the Russian response, which has been their offensives going to January. A lot of blood spilled, but not a lot of territory gained. At this rate, I saw one person work out it was going to take 15,000 years for the Russians to take over Ukraine. Well, that's not going to happen. And I think we're, really at the point where we'll see some significant offensive action for the Ukrainians in the coming months. Seen a lot of things in this war that people have gasped at and been surprised at and thought are new. The reality is there's very little new in this war. There's almost nothing new in this war that we've seen in the last 14 months. What we've seen is old lessons relearned, the importance of good leadership, whether it's tactical leadership from a squad leader on the ground or from a national president. We've seen the importance of international relationships and alliances reinforced, and NATO probably has the most purpose it's had for 30 or 40 years. We've seen the importance of logistics and national support systems, whether it is feeding your troops at the front or keeping the factories going to produce the ammunition they need. And we've seen the importance of things like just being good at combat. Really important. You can't win wars if you can't win in combat. But there are a couple of things I would propose that are new. I think the first one is supercharging of information operations. Not new. We've seen throughout history wars being a balance of violence and influence. But in the last decade or so, with big data, some clever algorithms, and a range of other methods that have been developed both in private industry and in government, the ability to target populations, subpopulations, sub-subpopulations with very discrete messaging and then measure its impact is probably something we haven't seen before. And I think the other new thing that we're seeing and is going to have a really profound impact on the future of conflict and national security affairs more broadly is the greater transparency that we're seeing with this war. Not full transparency, there's no such thing. Can't read people's minds. But this meshing of military, of government and civilian collection, assessment and dissemination of intelligence is new. And it means citizen journalists and commentators are just as widely read as a New York Times journalist or listened to just as much as some politicians on this war. It is new and it's going to have a pretty profound impact on the future of national security affairs more broadly, including in this country. So what's the way ahead? I think there's a couple of important considerations moving forward. The first one is for the Ukrainians' purpose. They need to continue to talk to the world about why this is important beyond Ukraine. They've done a pretty good job so far, I think. In fact, Zelensky and his team, and I've met a few of them, are the masters of influence operations. But clearly his statement, I don't need a right, I need ammunition, was the thing that electrified many people, unified his country and put them on the path to where they are. So purpose is important, not just for the Ukrainians to explain to us why they should defend themselves, but why we should help them defend themselves. And our governments also need to take up this. They need to explain to populations more broadly why it's important to spend national treasure on supporting Ukraine. We're not seeing a lot of that in this country, to be quite honest. I think the Australian government has been pretty weak and parsimonious in a lot of its efforts to support Ukraine and can do much better. So purpose is really important. The second area for the way ahead is production. At the end of the Cold War, we shut down a lot of factories. We consolidated a lot of defence companies. We cut the size of their military. We stopped a lot of training, and we cut a lot of our war stock. It made a lot of sense at the time, and no one was arguing with doing it at the time. However, there's a long hangover from that, and that means we're not good at industrial scale warfare, which is where we're at again. And this, be in no doubt, is a war of industrial systems. We haven't seen it for about 60 or 70 years. We're seeing industrial scale production being required. We're seeing industrial scale use of munitions, and we're seeing industrial scale killing. Now, the Battle of Bakhmut is the bloodiest battle we've seen on Earth since the Second World War. There's been nothing like it. It has been a carnal house, and it is but one of several battles that are similar to it. So that, I think, is the way ahead for what we're seeing. And the final piece I would say is Ukrainians need to be able to keep winning, because they've surprised us all with their performance so far. And I think that is down to the fact we didn't know them before this war. Certainly Australians didn't know them very well. I mean, as a Director General in charge of Army Strategy in 2013, I was looking at this pretty closely, and I think I wrote the only article in this country on the lessons from the war. But most people didn't know Ukraine, and therefore we've been surprised by their resilience, by their dedication, by their unity, and their professional capacity to actually beat one of the largest and most sophisticated armies in the world. But they can't do it alone. They need equipment, they need training, and frankly, they just need moral support for people who keep saying you're doing the right thing, you're helping protect democracy, not just in Ukraine, but more broadly, and you're helping send a message to other authoritarian predators in the world that we're not going to stand for this kind of behaviour. So I think I've finished my comments there, and happy to have a discussion and answer any questions.
Thanks, Mick. You mentioned that this is pretty much a European theatre conflict in how one would consider it in that conventional sense. But haven't we all been led to believe in the past that notwithstanding the border between the Warsaw Pact to the west, the Warsaw Pact doesn't exist anymore, but we thought that large columns of tanks sweeping across Germany, and how long could it be till they'd be stopped and all of that sort of stuff. I put it to you, and I'm a lay person and you're not, but it seems to me that what we've learned is that you don't want to be in a tank or an armoured vehicle in this conflict. They've been very far from decisive or successful. Is that right or not? I mean, why is that? And can I just add to that? Can you perhaps explain to us, from a country with very benign climatic conditions, how much summer, winter, spring, marsh, mud matters in a conflict?
In short, a lot. I'll go back to your first point about armoured vehicles. So the reality is they have been extraordinarily important and central to Ukraine's success. This tanks are dead narrative is not a new one. We've been hearing it since 1917, actually, after the Battle of Cambrai. And every generation flirts with you can win wars from the air. In every generation learns a hard way. That's just not possible, unfortunately. You've got to put your young men and women in the mud and fight it out at close quarters. It's just, unfortunately, that's the kind of animals we are. Tanks when they're used cleverly, are extraordinarily effective and survivable, precise, discriminate weapon systems. They're also the backbone of digital networking systems on the battlefield. Most people don't realise this. You can't carry enough batteries to keep your communications and the very fancy information systems you need going. You just can't. You need large, heavy vehicles to do all this. 50% of Russian tank losses were tanks that troops just got out of and walked away from for various reasons, whether they'd broken down or they didn't want to fight anymore. And a lot of the videos you see, these war-porn videos of Russian tanks being destroyed by DJI drones dropping things in the hatch, have been abandoned for a while. Have some of them been destroyed through other means? Absolutely. But that's what happens when you use tanks. And a lot of them have been destroyed, but there's a reason why the Russians and Ukrainians keep asking for it, because they know how effective they are. A lot of soldiers have been killed in this war, but no one's saying it's the end of soldiers. The Russians will not fly manned aircraft over Ukraine, but no one's saying it's the end of manned aircraft. So there's a curious debate that's arisen in certain corners of the internet and out of some cubicles in Canberra about the death of tanks. I can tell you it's not the death of tanks. We're going to see them. And I've got to tell you, if I had a choice, and I have, because I've commanded a mechanised brigade that has them once, that's what I want to be in. They're extraordinarily effective and survivable.
So on that point, just briefly to put a nuance on that then, how much, I mean, we've seen in the past stories about in Russia, corruption, people rather selling fuel destined to the military, pulling out parts to sell them on the black market. It's been a factor in Russia's ability to conduct this conflict. That instead of they'd rather sell the petrol to someone else to get some money than put it in the tanks that or the diesel that they're being defended with.
Yeah, I mean, there's a bit of that, and certainly the Russian army post Cold War is a bit more corrupt than the Soviet military was. Both were corrupt, but this one's a little bit more so. Certainly in barracks and senior officers see as an opportunity in Putin's Russia in particular to make a buck. I don't see it as a massive cause for Russian failure in this war. I mean, every little bit counts. But most of the Russian failure is down to a couple of things. Firstly, Putin's strategy, which was developed by him and a very small circle of advisors around him, was based on three very poor assumptions. Ukraine wasn't a real country. The Ukrainian military wouldn't fight, okay, and the West wouldn't step in to help. Now, you could probably get one of those assumptions wrong or even two and muddle your way through. You got all three wrong. And because he made those assumptions, their force structure and their plan was based around a short war. Everyone loves short wars, right? Where they'd be taking over the country in 10 days before the West can intervene and all these kind of things. That is the original sin of Russia in this war. Now, of course, the Russian military reforms, there was two phases, 08 to 12 and then 12 onwards under Shoigu and Gerasimov, have not gone as well as the Russians were telling us. They were telling us what a magnificent second best army in the world they developed. Clearly not true. Sounds like another country to our north telling us about how proficient they are at, operations around Taiwan. There's a lot to learn just from examining foreign countries' military transformation activities that we might learn from this. But the original sin was bad strategy, and you can lose a few battles and recover, but if you've got bad strategy, you're not going to recover, and that's where Russia is.
The weather aspect.
Oh, the weather aspect. So, snow, a lot of that. In that part of the world, the ground freezes for several months, and then it starts thawing, and so it gets muddy. But before the snow is also a rainy season, so they have a bit of mud on either end of the cold bits. They're just coming out of that muddy season right now. This was not a particularly bitter winter in Europe compared to some previous years, which clearly helped the Europeans get through without needing too much gas from Russia. But you're going to see things start drying out, thawing out, and that makes cross-country mobility much easier.
Just you spoke about the terrible losses suffered on both sides, but I just want to talk about the Russian losses. We've seen the involvement of groups such as Wagner, mercenaries, with the reported use of Russian prisoners, and indeed conscripts from parts of Russia where the opinions are not formulated. Remembering Russia's repopulating, so I suppose one-child families are fairly common in Russia. So you lose a son or daughter, that's it. So how much will this be an issue into the future? How long can Russia continue to just use people as cannon fodder before there is a strong domestic reaction to that? Because that's been what they've in totalitarian countries in conflict with the West. That's what they've relied on in the West. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I mean that's the real question, isn't it? Everyone's trying to figure that out. It's kind of, if it was Australia, it'd be like Canberra only sending troops from Queensland, Northern Territory, and Tasmania to fight all its battles and protecting the New South Welshmen and Victorians. And I don't think it'd go down terribly well here. And I don't know that it is going down terribly well in Russia either. But how long people will tolerate it is another question. Putin, over 20 years, has built a remarkably resilient authoritarian regime that is able to detect and kind of stamp out dissent in a way that we can't even imagine in this country. I think, they can keep doing this for a while yet. They're a big country, 140 million, even though they have demographic challenges, significant demographic challenges because of low birth rates, not long life expectancies. I mean, life expectancies in Russia continue to decline, although they have in the US in the last couple of years as well, but, Russia has been seeing a general decline for various reasons. They've got a lot of long-term problems, but in the short term, they can probably sustain this for a while. They haven't come close to mobilising all the people they possibly can for this war.
We'll talk about drones for a second. We've seen drones as a battlefield surveillance tool quite extensively, but I want to ask you about drones as an offensive weapon. And we've seen the Russians use the Iranian drones. And I want to ask you, from a military point of view, in the Second World War, the V1s and V2s, I mean, they were more. Obviously, you wouldn't want to be near one, but they were more weapons of terror than weapons of great military advantage. We've seen a lot of electricity assets taken out. Can you tell us about the effect of these offensive drones in Ukraine? Are they psychological primarily? Is that their purpose, or is it to take out infrastructure? Or just explain that to us.
Yeah, I mean, they are psychological to get hit by one.
Exactly.
And then it's not very psychological, but we've been using drones since the Second World War, not just V1 and V2s. I mean, the Germans had teleoperated missiles that they attacked the battleship in off Italy with. They had remote controlled mini tanks, Enzio and Normandy, go up to troops and explode. And we've been refining these techniques ever since, not just for surveillance, but for attack. It's pretty sophisticated at the moment with aerial drones. I mean, the Ukrainians have tens of thousands of them in operation, all different kinds. I mean, everything from the tiny Black Hornets, which we use, come out of your hand, to much larger, longer endurance systems. And one of the things these drones have done is close what I call the detection to destruction time. When I was a brigade commander, we used to plan on 10 minutes. From when you were detected, you had 10 minutes to live unless you were moving, and moving pretty smartly. Now it's 1 to 5 minutes max. And that's going to change some ways we design military forces. There's a whole lot of things that can't move that quickly, including air bases. So it's going to change that regime. On the offensive side, loitering munitions have come into their own in this conflict. And a loitering munition is something you basically launch, can be launched from a cannon, can be launched by hand, can be launched by catapult, can be dropped from an aircraft or even a larger drone, and it just loiters for an hour or two waiting for a target. And the target can be human detected and prosecuted, or it can use artificial intelligence, and we've seen that in the last couple of years. And then when it finds a target, just goes on to kills it. Now, it can be a tank, can be artillery, can be a group of humans, could be a logistic dump, could be a headquarters. They're my favourite targets. But you see this offensive capability having built up over the last few years in a way that we haven't quite seen before. And we have Australian companies that are building these kind of systems for us and exporting to Ukraine. They're going to be enormously important for the future battlefield, and you're going to see thousands, tens of thousands of loitering munitions at any one time. And the ability to hide and to deceive the adversary is going to be very important. So you don't get hit by one of these things. On the home front, clearly Putin has used a range of different missile and cruise missile systems to both terrorise the Ukrainians, attempt to coerce the Ukrainian government into negotiations, and attack their energy infrastructure. It's failed. And one of the reasons it's failed is because the Ukrainians worked out that if you left the power on during an attack, it was all the secondary and tertiary impacts of hitting power infrastructure that took down the system. If you turned off the power just before it hit, all those secondary and tertiary impacts went away and you could get your power up much more quickly. So it's made this much more expensive for the Russians with much smaller return for them. They've basically given up on it because they've realised it's not having the impact. They'll do some attacks every now and then based on whatever their monthly missile production is, which isn't very high, but it's failed as a tool of coercion, it's failed as a tool of terror, and it's failed as a tool to persuade foreign investors to go in and invest in the country.
It's interesting. You mentioned how long you've got before you can move and headquarters attacks. Two comments I would make that you might want to respond to. One, it seems to me that they've said the logistics chain has had to get much longer because they've had to set back fuel dumps and command positions much further because of Ukrainian success in striking them. And I remember that particular instance 6 months or so ago, where a Russian television reporter had been in front of a barracks and was, went almost, I think, live to air or something about, doing a story from the barracks. And of course, the Ukrainians went bang, and they, knew where he was and then took out the whole barracks. I mean, so
it's brilliant.
You want to be very, very careful when you talk to someone and they're filming you, don't you? In fact, I'm amazed that Zelensky has, no doubt he is their number one person that they want to target, that he has managed to be so clever in avoiding any sorts of attacks on himself, because I'm sure the Russians are trying to do it all the time.
Yeah, the ability to hide in the noise will be vital in the future. You can't hide, full stop, but you can make yourself a less valuable target. That's really the art of the future. If you're detected, you can be hit. So it's about, if you are detected, be the least valuable target. Everyone remember the old cartoon of the deer in the crosshairs going like that to his friend? That's kind of the concept you need to imagine in the future, is how do you become the deer pointing that way? And there's been some very clever deception. The Ukrainians have a couple of hundred fake HIMARS launchers out there. Now, this is an old tool, fake tanks, fake headquarters, all this kind of thing to deceive the adversary about where you might be doing something or where your critical high-value systems are. There's all these layers of both managing your signature, deceiving the adversary, and making sure he uses very valuable missiles on decoys, not the real high-value targets.
Some questions from the audience. Questions, anyone? Holland.
Yes. Since World War II, Australia, along with its allies, if I can put it that way, I'll just use that neutral expression, have not been unwilling to go into other countries, to send troops to other countries in defence of what we say are our values, defending democracy and defending freedom. And, one only has to, the countries I'm talking about, Vietnam, Iraq twice,
Korea, Namibia, Cambodia,
Somalia, even Timor to a slightly different extent. But this time we don't seem to be. And you talk about giving support and that we're not giving enough support. It seems the obvious reason or answer is we don't want to provoke a nuclear response from Putin. I expect that's probably your answer. But what will it take for us to do that, to commit, to use the expression boots on the ground, and not just us, but I don't imagine we're going to do it if NATO doesn't do it. And so what will it take for NATO to say, all right, the Rubicon's been crossed, we're now sending troops in? Because it seems to me that if it didn't or doesn't escalate to a nuclear confrontation, that NATO could force Russian forces out of Ukraine very quickly with its combined strength, having seen how poorly the Russians have prosecuted the war today. So what do you say? What's to that?
Well, there's a couple of things in there.
Yeah.
Firstly, the assumption NATO could push Russia out of Ukraine. I think that's the case, but once again, we don't want to assume that it'd be a quick war and easy. That was what the Russians did, and look what happened. Although I think you're right. Secondly, why aren't there boots on the ground? There's a couple of reasons. Firstly, I do think the Russian nuclear deterrent did assist. Certainly, talking in DC a couple of weeks ago to a couple of experts on this, the Russians believe it worked, nuclear deterrence worked. But I think too, the Ukrainians early on knew they actually didn't need Western people. They just needed Western weapons, Western intelligence, Western diplomatic support, and Western sanctions. And I think they were very clever in going down that route because it was far more productive. And essentially, they did what clever negotiators do, is give them something that's easy to say yes to. That's what they did with NATO and the United States. Give them something they can say yes to. Handing over some artillery is really easy. Sending your young people in to die very hard, especially in the wake of the disaster in Afghanistan and places like that. So it was partially Russian nuclear deterrence, but also partially, I think, clever diplomacy on the part of Ukraine and some of its advisors. What would it take? Well, ironically, I think it's probably if Russia did use nuclear weapons, all bets would be off for a few reasons. Firstly, I don't think it would decisively change the course of the war. You'd have to use a lot of tactical nuclear weapons, and the Ukrainians aren't just giving them the targets. If they did use nuclear weapons, there would be a lot of fallout, and guess where it would go? Over Europe. That would make the Europeans very unhappy again after Chernobyl. And I think the Russians will have crossed more than just the Rubicon. I think there would be a fundamental breakdown in deterrence, and the Europeans will decide, right, that's it. We're going to end this war because the suffering has become too much for us to tolerate. And we shouldn't forget there is a humanitarian imperative here, right? One of the reasons I'm a big believer in getting this war won and getting it won quickly is there's a humanitarian imperative to make sure the least people suffer in winning the war. The best way to do that is help the Ukrainians win quickly. Remember, it's all Ukrainians who are dying here, some Russians, but it's all Ukrainians dying. So the quicker we can help them win, the less Ukrainians die, and that is a good thing for everyone.
Hello, Shirley King. Oh, thanks, Mick. I'm wondering about, excuse me, two strategies that are being used. Russian journalists based in Netherlands.
Water?
I think I'm all right. The Russian journalists based in the Netherlands going back to the Russian people. Thank you.
You want it to come back?
Oh,
You're
no,
right.
You can text it to me.
Anyway, yeah, thank you. The Russian people, journalists based in, what I'm asking about is the strategy, whether it's old war strategy or modern war strategy. The Russians, journalists in Netherlands now from Latvia, who are feeding back to the Russian people, trying to change their minds and encourage them. So that's one aspect.
You're saying get them to not support Putin or to support
Not
Putin?
support Putin.
So Medusa IO.
And the other aspect that has only become known to me recently is all the children that have been are being held, the Ukrainian children being held by Russians, and its effect on the Ukrainian people. So that's a war strategy as well. So is it old strategy, new strategy? I don't think it doesn't matter, but are they effective strategies?
I think the former is probably not having much impact, to be quite frank. Russian state TV and the other coercive arms of the Russian government, particularly in the last 5 years or so, has really clamped down on dissent in Russia. The Russian people don't have a lot of opportunity for dissent anymore. I mean, for the first 10 years or so of Putin's rule, people were happy to go along because it was making them rich, right? The last 10 years, there's been a process by which, there were three main groups of advisors Putin used to surround himself with. There was the economic advisors, there was the political advisors, and then there was the security types. Well, over the last 5 or 10 years, he's got rid of the economic and the political advisors, but kept the security types, which means there's not a lot of tolerance of dissent, and he actually uses the different security services to kind of compete for who can be the most, what we would call repulsive, frankly, in their repression in there and other countries. That's the first one. Secondly, you talked about the kidnapping of Ukrainian children. It's a systemic program. I mean, it's not like it's bad apples doing it. This is happening in the thousands. And it's what Putin is going to be brought to The Hague for. That's what they got him for, is the systemic, not ones and twos, but systemic kidnap of children and taking them to Russia. Partially, it's because of their own demographic problem. Partially, it's just habit. It's not the first time the Russians have done this. And, as repulsive and as sickening as we find it, for some Russians, it's just natural because there's been a narrative in the Russian press that the Ukrainians aren't, there's this gradual narrative. And if you watch Russian state TV, and there are people who watch it for us so we don't have to, there's been this gradual narrative that Ukrainians are animals, and taking their children was just a natural thing to do so they don't grow up as Nazis. Yeah, to protect them. And it's really sickening stuff, to be quite frank.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that surprised me is that the attention on Ukraine hasn't been, there's no shortage of separatist groups in Russia. And, we've seen in the past Chechen, resistance and the like. But there's been no apparent recrudescence of any of these bodies. They've not I would have thought that if you're a separatist group in Russia, now is the time to, because we've seen them withdraw from Syria, and it's to an extent. I would have thought now's the time to play up while the Russians are distracted by the Ukrainian conflict, but there's been no evidence that I'm aware of that happening. What is that?
Not in Russia, but some of its former republics are, kind of looking at each other going, is this the right time? And I'd recommend, for a real expert in this stuff, Peter Tesh, whose former DFAT official, was our ambassador in Moscow. I work with him in the Department of Defense, very fine diplomat and human being. And he is a real expert. If you ever want to get someone on just talk about Russia, boy, you would knock everyone down. He's fantastic. So I think, Russia itself, the security architecture now really tamps down the ability of people to do it internally. But I think some of the former republics are kind of looking around going, maybe now's the time. The Russians are pulling out a lot of their peacekeeping forces. And
Graham,
Thank you, Mick, for your very stimulating talk tonight. Early in the war, there were quite a number of international commentators giving gratuitous advice to the Ukrainians, saying, look, you really need to go and compromise and, work out a deal.
They're still
just
doing
to
it.
stop that.
Make it on.
To what extent has that narrative changed? And people realise, look, international people may say that, but the Ukrainians aren't going to accept it at all.
I think it's decreased a bit, but it's still there. And there's still a lot of people out there. The most important thing is to stop the fighting. It's like, not if the enemy owns 20% of your country.
No.
And that 20% it's occupying the undertaking a systemic kidnapping of children, torture, rape, murder of the citizens that are there. I mean, none of this stuff that's going on there is bad apples. Right? Of the 30 or 40 torture chambers the Ukrainians have captured from the Russians so far, all of them were laid out exactly the same. Right? Exactly the same. This is a systemic program to subjugate and exterminate the Ukrainian state. Why would the Ukrainians give up now? Let me tell you a story. On my last visit to Ukraine, I got on the train. I had second-class sleeper. quite comfortable actually. And there were two middle-aged ladies in there. I went, this is going to be interesting to explain to my wife. But anyways, they were lovely, and they just both returned from visiting children overseas. And we pretty much talked all night about their circumstances, their experiences of the war. They were from places around Kiev and north. Both of them spoke Russian before the war, how long ago. Both of them had Russian relatives. Both of them said to me, we don't care how many Russian men, women and children we're going to kill to win this war, but we're going to win it. The Ukrainians are not going to give up, whether we support them or not, because too much has happened. After Bucha, they will fundamentally change. So they were serious before Bucha and other places, Liman, and Kherson, and all the other places where Russian atrocities have been found. But after that, they deeply understand that Russia is a country that wants to exterminate. Why would they give up? Would we?
So then you're faced, even with Russians, one on the ground, you're faced with an insurgency forever.
Probably. And I don't think they are going to.
Well, we'll get to that.
Yeah.
Ian.
Thanks so much, Mick. Great suggestion about Turkey. Another Queenslander, by the way.
Yes, UQ, great, very engaging.
But it's not living here at the moment.
No, that's
right. If you can get him up here, I mean, he's a national treasure.
We can conspire.
Yeah.
Question is the Russian military learning from its mistakes?
I think they are. And there's a lot of people who disagree with me on this. And I was recently talking, a friend of mine is an Israeli scholar by the name of Dima Adansky, who's looked at the Russian military for 30 years. He is a deep expert. He kind of said, thank goodness you're saying the Russians are adapting, because no one agrees with me that they are learning. They're just not learning as fast or across as many endeavours as the Ukrainians are. They learnt that after they failed before Kiev, they had to kind of recock their strategy and focus on one area. They've learned that their air operations have to continuously evolve, and they've done that. They're now shooting at Ukraine with long-range glide bombs. It's really smart if you think about it. They've had to change their tactics on the ground. They've set up different stormtrooper detachments like the Germans did in the First World War. And there's a whole lot of adaptations. In fact, I'm writing a couple of chapters in my book just on that at the moment. So the Russians have learned, they have adapted, but they haven't been as good at learning and adapting as the Ukrainians have. I think for a couple of reasons. Firstly, this is existential for the Ukrainian. When you're under threat, all kind of things become possible that are not possible otherwise. Secondly, Ukrainian society seems to be more grassroots, bottom up. People take charge of things. I mean, I interviewed a bunch of government officials up to ministerial level in my recent trip there. And to a person, they said the thing that surprised them most was how much the Ukrainian people stood up instantly to help defend their country, and then went and did it. They didn't just say, we want to do it. They just went out and did it. And that was part of why the first month they were able to, beat the Russians. So I think the Ukrainians are winning the adaptation battle. But it doesn't mean the Russians aren't learning, and we should not be arrogant, and we should be very prudent when looking at the Russian military, because you should never assume your enemy's stupid. That is a very bad mistake to make, and I see it too much in some of the commentaries.
Now, you will have to be patient with the question. A lot of people asking questions here, so I'll get to you all.
So that doesn't mean I'm repulsed by what they do, but we can't assume they
Understand.
David,
Yeah.
and then we'll take one online.
Okay, thanks, Mick. We had the Ukrainian ambassador to Australia here speaking to us in this room last year, and he was saying, look, we want all of it back. We want Donbass. We want Crimea. Do you think there will have to be a negotiated settlement at some stage where Ukraine gives up some territory?
I don't see why it should. That'd be like saying, you can have Tasmania. Why would we do that? Ukraine is Ukraine, Donbass is Ukraine. So recognised as such under international law. The EU, NATO, United States all recognise it. There's very few countries that don't, which include Russia, a few of its client states. Will there be a negotiation? Probably. There's this meme going around, all wars end by negotiation, but not all negotiations are equal. When there was a negotiation in Tokyo in August 1945, but it wasn't equal. There was a negotiation outside Berlin in 1945, but it wasn't equal either. It was pretty short. So will there be a negotiation? Probably, but not all wars end with both sides on equal standing negotiating. Sometimes one of them's on their knees.
Well, I'll use the chair's prerogative to interpose here. Surely Putin looks at how did Saddam Hussein go? How did Ceausescu go? You end up losing one of these conflicts. There's one alternative for these sort of guys. They don't end up alive. And so that means the stakes for him is far, far higher than just about anyone else in Russia. That, to me, doesn't make, standing in the shoes of your opponents, which I like to do in my game of politics, that doesn't make it, to me, seem that why would he care about more Russians being killed? He cares about whether he gets killed ultimately, and that happens if he compromised.
Yeah. No, I mean, there's been a militarisation of the Russian state. Russia experts probably talk about this more lucidly, but there has been a certain militarisation of the Russian state since the beginning of the war, and it's in Putin's interest for the war to keep going because it's how he keeps his power down. He's militarised all the arms of state. They haven't proven terribly efficient at mobilisation. They have been able to mobilise. They have been able to smooth out some of the chaos and issues, and they certainly have more potential to mobilise if they need to. No, you're right. He has no interest in ending this war.
Well, compromise for him probably means death. Our question online, please.
Thanks, Paul. I got a question here from Kevin. Notwithstanding the industrial context.
Kevin Rudd.
That would be Mr. Ambassador.
Notwithstanding the industrial context of this war, I'd be interested in your views on the cyber warfare dimension of this campaign. In particular, how well has Ukraine responded in this domain, and how poor has Russia's performance been?
Yeah. So one of the Australian minor good news stories is there's a little Australian company called Internet 2.0 that's currently in Kiev training members of Ukrainian government and security services in cyber security. And it's a really good news story, which we saw more of, to be quite honest. The reality is, since 2014, the Ukrainians have put a lot of effort into securing their cyber infrastructure, their telecommunications infrastructure. I mean, Monash IP is a Monash University Twitter feed that provides real-time stats on the availability of the internet in Ukraine, and they've kept it at 80-90% throughout the war because they hardened their telecommunications infrastructure, which has enabled to get out the stories and images of this war, which has supported their global influence campaign. There's been some really good reports out there. Microsoft has done some good work, and a few other scholars, I think, have looked at cyber operations in the war. There's been a lot of it going on. It's just you don't see it. It's pretty hard for most people to see what's going on in the cyber domain, but there's been a lot of it going on both sides, and also against Europeans, Americans, and this country as well. It's going on constantly. It's just one of those areas that's not as visible as, say, tanks shooting at stuff or planes being shot out of the sky.
The gentleman there in the blue shirt, you were next.
Thanks. Mick, a lot of talk about Ukraine winning, but in terms of the challenges, the real military challenges they're facing, whether it's artillery or manpower, what are your expectations for what's possible? I mean, everyone's expecting these counter-offensives at some point. What's your realistic expectation of what's possible?
No, absolutely. I'm not sure if everyone read it, but in December, General Zelensky, current chief, gave a really good interview for The Economist. And in there he said, to the soldiers who are currently on the front line, God forgive me, you are not my priority. My priority is building the force that comes next, which is the force of mechanics. Building a large force, probably 3 pretty significant combined arms organisations, division/corps size, armed with Western equipment, which Ukrainians got better equipment as the war gone on. The Russians have got older equipment. There's a significant asymmetric advantage there. There is the potential for significant operational penetration exploitation used wisely. There's been a lot of training going on in staffs at high levels outside of Ukraine. There's been a lot of intelligence sharing and wargaming support provided to the Ukrainians. And the reality is the Ukrainians have surprised us at every step of this war. They've done things we just did not expect them to do at every step. I expect them to keep doing that. And, you know, when things look pretty grim, I just think back to, you know, how did things look in Australia on December 23rd, 1941, when our troops were close to being overrun in Singapore, the Americans being bombed at Pearl Harbor. Things weren't looking real good, still won, and we didn't give up. And that's the kind of attitude we're going to have to Ukraine.
Caspar, and it also, if there's some women, we've got an asymmetric question asking here, so I'll get you up. I'll get you next after Caspar.
Nick, I just got two questions really. In 2014, Ukraine was offered a membership to the NATO. They declined. But the worry is about in Europe that because the Ukraine is nearly part of Russia. We call them still the Russian people. I thought they
call them that, the Russians.
Yep. We still call them that. They have a similar mentality as the Russian. They are the Russian as well, and being a part of Russia. What we thought in Europe, what Putin was doing, quick into topple the government, and then would be a referendum that it would come to Russia. What is your view on that?
Yeah, firstly, Ukrainians don't see themselves as Russians. They might speak Russian, doesn't mean they are Russians. We speak English, doesn't mean we're British. Ukrainians are a distinct culture. They have their own language, they have their own traditions going back 1,000 years. And if you were to tell a Ukrainian speaker now that you're just an adjunct to Russia, you'd probably get a punch in the nose.
Now you get it.
Yeah. Well, there were a lot of people before the war as well, to be quite frank. You know, there's a reason they voted overwhelmingly for their own independence in 1991. They saw themselves as a distinct sovereign nation with their own culture, language, traditions, and everything else. And since independence, they have been slowly working on their relationships with Europe, with the EU. They've had a security partnership with NATO since the mid-1990s, upon which all the current assistance is based. Would they like to be part of NATO? Absolutely. You know, and the irony is that would be a very secure southern flank for Russia if they were in NATO. That's the tragedy of the whole thing, right? Will they become part of NATO? I don't know. I know that the theory of victory for Ukraine has to embrace both winning the war and winning the peace. Like winning the war, you've got to beat the Russians and kick them out. But winning the peace, you've got to have long-term security guarantees. They know that. What does that look like? Might be NATO, might be other countries, but they also have to set themselves up for economic prosperity. They have to achieve justice for the things that have been done to them, which is going to be difficult, but not impossible. And they also have to re-establish a level of social cohesion once all million refugees return who haven't experienced the war, once soldiers return from the war, once they deal with people who still want to speak Russian but are Ukrainians, and once they deal with collaborators. So there's all these elements of their theory of victory about, you know, have to win the war and win the peace. And corruption. And this future security posture is going to be a really important part of it. You know, the great tragedy, everyone I spoke to in Kiev said, you know, even if we win this, we might have to fight another one until the Russians change their imperial, colonial kind of aspirations. So it's really tragic when you think about it. You can't take Ukraine away from Russia, unfortunately.
My name's Lucinda. My question is a bit more political than practical, I suppose, but this sense in the United States and a lot of European countries seems to be increasingly saying, why do we keep sending, and the political cartoons are blank checks to Ukraine, and especially in the United States. We know that if Trump gets in again, he makes a lot of promises, like one of his is cutting it off, and he said he'd build a wall and he never did, so a Trump promise doesn't mean very much. But what is your thoughts on what will happen if we get Republicans in the next US election, and that economic impact and that sort of the javelins stop getting sent over overnight? What impact could the lack of American assistance have immediately?
I guess it depends on what kind of Republican. And there's lots of different types of Republicans. They're not just all Trump, DeSantis clones. And in some respects, Trump was a bit of a discontinuity in American foreign policy. I mean, there's a lot of continuity in American policy. If you have a look at Afghanistan, we were there for 20 years. through all kinds of different administrations. And through those 20 years, people say, oh, we want to stop this and we don't want to do this. For 20 years we did that, which is kind of what we're seeing now. And we have boots on the ground, people dying in Afghanistan. We don't have that in Ukraine. Ukraine for the West is so easy. It's just a bit of money. And it's a small amount of money for what it's achieving. I actually think Western support for Ukraine is more durable than we think. I think we have more strategic patience than governments give citizens credit for. You know, and I look at our own country in COVID. The Australian people were bloody magnificent. It was a great moment for our country how the Australian people had. Now, some of the governments were idiots, but I thought the Australian people had a great balance of individual versus community rights. And a lot of other countries did as well. So I have a lot of faith that we have the patience to support Ukraine over a long period of time, at least as long as we did for Afghanistan. And if you want to look at an exemplar, I think Korea would be it. You know, Korea for many, many years was trouble. It was not a shining light for democracy for decades after the armistice. But look where they are now.
Really, the past 25 years.
Yeah, that's right. And Taiwan, you know, went on that journey too. And Ukraine is much more advanced in democratic norms, and there's some other areas that probably need to be fixed. But, you know, it is possible. You just need a bit of patience, engagement, and vision.
It does seem that the Ukrainian people, at least I'm a very, very online person, and I see these people that are dying every day. And they all seem just to be very exceptional people. Everyone's super fit, everyone's educated, or even if they're not, they're just dedicated. It seems their depth of talent is incredible, and they've not run out of great people yet. Do you think that's because they're pro-Soviet and they're all just a bit harder than us, maybe? Or do you think that any similar democratic country would have the right stuff like they have?
Well, you talk to Ukraine and say, hey, we fought 2 revolutions to get the government we got now. I mean, this wasn't a perfectly formed democracy in 1991, right?
Yeah.
So they had two revolutions to get where they are now. And it's still, I'll admit to you, it's still a work in progress. You know, before this war, President Zelensky was not a man of the people. He wasn't very popular. He had I think a 20% popularity rate or something. Now, that's fundamentally changed now, obviously. But no, I mean, I think the Ukrainians since 1991 have been given an opportunity just to rediscover who they are as Ukrainians. Like I said, they have a very long history as their own culture, their own language and these kind of things. And certainly now, you know, they're more proud of that than they ever have been. And they're going to reinforce that differentness from the Russians and their neighbours for a long time to come. I think that's great, you know. The more different cultures, the better off humanity is.
We've got to close now. 30 seconds on Belarus.
Yeah, I mean,
I don't understand what they see as an end game for them. Unlike others, they are very susceptible.
Yeah, I just think Belarus sees itself as a country that's probably in transition, but at a much earlier stage of Ukraine. And the current president would like that transition to go very, very, very slowly indeed.
Well, look, thank you very much. Mick, I think we could have been here for twice as long, frankly, where we go out on the internet to people, and well, what a wonderful contribution. Thank you for being so forthcoming in your answers. We look forward to getting you back in relation to talk about matters in Asia with your book White Sun later in the year when it's launched, not too far off launching. Can I recommend to you Futura Doctrina, Mick's blog? It's wonderful. So thank you very much, Mick, for being here tonight.